This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 356, the book module. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about the book module with Chad Hester. Chad has recently moved to Vancouver, immigrating from Baltimore with his wife, thanks to support from ImageX. It was a beautiful drive with all his stuff across the country. Chad, welcome back to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Also joining us as co-host for the next 4 weeks is Ryan Price. Ryan is a solutions architect at FFW, who has been involved in the Drupal community since 2006. He was a founding member of the Florida Drupal meetups and Drupal camp, and now lives in Portland, Oregon, where he helps organize the local meetups. He's frequently involved with mentoring activities such as Drupal Easy's Drupal Career Online program. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's been a little while, but I'm super excited to be here for for an artist in residence. I don't know what you call these.
I think we've been calling it guest host.
The guest host seat. You get to fill it. Yeah.
Well, I'm Nick Laughlin, and today my other co-host is, as usual, John Picozzi.
Here I am, everyone. Here I am.
We have a new module of the week. This is another one of those modules that you expect that we would have done over the past 8-9 years. The module of the week this week is Purge. The Purge module facilitates cleaning external caching systems and reverse proxies, as well as CDNs. So it's something that the Drupal system uses to notify external systems when a cache expires and make sure that you're not serving stale content. I use it most commonly with something like Varnish. It's used by, I think, Acquia. You can use it with Pantheon, or if you have your own install of Varnish. But it works with almost any reverse proxy. It's easy to set up, and if you have any external caching, it's completely essential.
Yeah, I actually use it with Cloudflare. There's a Cloudflare Purge module, I think, that attaches onto it. So pretty helpful, pretty useful.
Yeah, I think usually when I work with Cloudflare, for some reason, I just hook right into the API directly. I'm not really sure why.
Yeah, I think the Purge module uses Purge to help alleviate, obviously Purge caches, but I think it also has a ability to route IPs correctly or report IPs correctly, because I think one of the issues that you have maybe with Cloudflare is that your Drupal site can often see the same IP as if it were, because it's just coming from Cloudflare. I think there's something in there that mitigates that, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I don't recall. So moving on from our module of the week, we're going to start with our usual softball question. Ryan, Chad, can you tell us what the book module is?
Yeah. I think in its essence, it creates a hierarchy of different pieces of content. The idea comes from, stitching together chapters or sections of a book, and it provides different navigation components to help people browse that content as it goes through, as well as some administrative tools to make it really easy to populate different books, just from a high level.
What are books typically populated with? Are they just nodes? Is that the idea there?
Yep, that's exactly it. So it's typically nodes. It will start off a lot of times when you first install the module with a book node. So that can be the beginning of things. You can kind of consider the first node to be the cover of the book, so to speak. So that's kind of like the subject matter, the introduction, whatever you may have, or it's just the first page. After that, then you can start adding things to that book.
So I guess, a question here is, like, I'm super unclear, I guess, how I've used maybe the book module once in my entire Drupal career. So unclear on how it works. Wondering at like a high level if you could give some use cases. So we have the idea of like a book, right? And like when you think of a book, like you think of a book, it has, you know, a table of contents, it has chapters, it has pages, right? Like, is that the same thing that the book module is going after?
Yeah, it takes that concept and just extends it a little bit further into the digital world. So it's not just a flat list of things like chapters in a book. There is the idea of a hierarchy, so you can kind of build into it a little bit. So anytime we think back to earlier forms of the internet, a lot of times, you know, before the World Wide Web, this interlinking of pages that can kind of cross-link. Think Wikipedia is a great example of cross-linking things. It's just one big web of information. I write an article about, you know, the United States, and maybe there's a relationship to Abraham Lincoln and back and forth. Well, that's not so much a serialized list. You have more of a stricter hierarchy. It's not a poly hierarchy where you have multiple parents, multiple children. It's really opinionated to say this is just a list of things. So a great example of that might be a user manual, or something that is very well structured. So ergo, book really holds well as skeuomorphic sort of design concept. It's less visual, more structural in nature. So when you put things together with the book module, it offers you a little bit of things that seem familiar from a Drupal perspective. You would think, hey, why not use menus? Why not use fields to kind of stitch these things together? And you certainly could go that route, and we can kind of explore that a little bit. But the idea here is similar to, I'd say, the form module. It's very opinionated. It has a very specific use case, but you can very quickly outgrow that use case if you're using it a bit beyond what it's intended to do.
So something I've used book module for in the past is like organizing a wiki. So, you know, Drupal out of the box doesn't really come with like wiki formatting things, but if you use like Markdown for writing wiki text, or if you wanted to get fancy and use Wikipedia syntax, there used to be modules that would do that in Drupal, but you can use the hierarchy of the book to create sort of like a wiki. And it comes with blocks too, right? You can list like all the top level pages of the book in a block. And then as you drill down, listed on the page you're on, you can go to the parent page, or you can go to any of the child pages. That's like things that are sort of built in is the navigation of navigating around the book to different sections of your document, whatever that happens to be, this sort of like collection of information.
It's hard to visualize when just hearing us talk about it. I think it's important to try these things out if you're interested in kind of a prototype sort of fashion. So if you're not sure about different Drupal solutions, really just create a sandbox, you know, Simply Test Me or something like that. Go try out adding a little bit of content, turn on the module. And there are a couple of guides. So Drupal.org has its own book module overview that you can kind of just get into the basics of what it is. It doesn't go into too much depth, but Acquia and OS Training also have more in-depth information to kind of get you into here's how you actually use this module. It's real quick, easy to set up. Acquia is a video, and OS Training has more of just an article that walks you through how to use it.
Did we say this? That if you've ever used the documentation pages on Drupal.org, particularly editing them, you're editing a book.
Yep.
No, but I think that's probably why it's still in core. If I had to guess, it's used extensively on Drupal.org, I think.
And I think it's really good for intranet sites. So if you have just you know, a normal marketing site or an organization site, you may not necessarily have a use case for it. But as you have lots of documentation that starts to have very deliberate structure, and you need to guide people in and out, exactly like what Ryan said, you can not only create those structures, but it provides these navigation elements that make it easier to understand at a glance what can I find? So you have the paging element at the bottom, which kind of goes previous page, next page, and up a page. But you also have the other block that kind of gives you the table of contents, which you have a little bit of control over what that does.
So Chad, maybe we could also talk about some of the things that make the book module unique. Like, what are some of the reasons why I would reach for the book module over just like sticking pages into a menu or maybe using taxonomy?
It doesn't use all of the same stuff that comes out of the box with things like fields and menus. What it does is, again, it's a little bit opinionated. So it provides you a couple of blocks that you can use. So table of contents, the navigation element towards the bottom. And in that navigation element, not only does it have previous, next, and up, it also has call to action links if you have permission for it to add a child page. So if you're managing that content, it makes it really accessible for you as a administrator, content manager. It also offers print-friendly version. So the idea that you're producing this thing as a book, you might want to print out something like, maybe this is the HR manual and this is the list of holidays. Well, yeah, I want to print that out because I want to know when I have off and I can coordinate that with my family. It does provide, like that full hierarchy for sidebars or even abbreviated versions, which is kind of nice. So you don't really have to build all of these different menus and views. It kind of does a bit of that for you. And as soon as I want to add something new to the HR manual, I just go in to the admin interface and just kind of piece that together.
I think that's kind of the primary thing, is because when you generally think about it, if you're referencing things together, using it to reference, and if you're looking at an hierarchy, you generally think taxonomy, right? Or maybe a menu. But the thing that the book module also provides, aside from the hierarchy, is embedded into the system, is an embedded order. So if you're using a text, say you decide to do it with a taxonomy, because I've done this in the past with other projects where I've built a book light using taxonomies. You end up having to build a whole lot of other infrastructure to make sure that you're preserving the order of the pages per se in the hierarchy. Whereas the book module kind of has that embedded. So you have that concept of like, what's the next page? And if you're going to the next page and it's the last page at that level and the next page is up a level, up 2 levels or something, it just handles that. It very much is one of those modules that not everybody has a need for it, but if you have a need for it, it does the job much better than anything else. So let's kind of get back to, you've mentioned kind of intranets. Are there other? I guess one of my questions for you is, how often do you use the book module, and what kinds of things like are triggers for you in your mind when you're talking about a project with somebody that, hey, maybe we should dust off the book module for this project and look at that for the architecture?
I'd say it's exceedingly rare, but when that one use case kind of comes along, it tends to be a strong use case, a solution for that use case. So I'd say, again, intranet, that kind of is the easy go-to when it comes to documentation that is organized well enough by a collection of people that you can kind of have some sort of control over that. It's not so much the free-for-all of content. Just like the forum module is very opinionated in what it does. It has its specific use case, and you may not grab the forum module if you wanted to make a forum. Personally, I hate the fighting of spam if it's a public-facing thing. But if you specifically want that structure, it's a really good solution.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things too that it does really well, is it makes it very easy for a content admin to add stuff, rearrange stuff, and edit stuff. Whereas if you're building kind of a homegrown, I mean, obviously the book module's core, so it's the Drupal way. But if you're building a quote unquote Drupal way book light, then there's a lot of training that has to be added on how do you add something, how do you order it, how do you rearrange it. I have used the book module a few times over the years. I think the 2 best use cases I've had for it, one was when I built a city government site. They needed the ability to post some bylaws. and bylaws are pretty naturally segmented into different sections and subsections. So it was a really easy way for them to keep them up to date, make changes when they happened, or add new sections when they needed to be added. And they used that, very successfully for years. And then the other time that I used it, or a couple of times that I've used it that have been really effective, have been trainings or like courses. So somebody wants to provide access to some training materials, just like Drupal.org documentation. When you need to break up the documentation in multiple levels, the book module really excels. Where building it yourself will be painful.
Chad, I'm curious. Do you have a real world use case where you've used the book module recently that like you were like, oh well, we used it for I don't know, this thing or that thing?
So I do. I can't say the name because the site hasn't launched, but I can at least talk generally about it.
Sure.
We had a Drupal 6 site, so pretty classic example, something that needs to get off an old version of Drupal. And it had a lot of medical text, things about, I could be vague enough not to tip off what this might be, but it's about things like poison control. So if you have a collection of different things that need to help a population, having that in a structured format can make things a little bit easier to find. And that's sometimes, that's the number one thing as a, an information architect that we always see in websites that have some sort of a frustrating user point, which is, I can't find what I'm looking for. So we look for solutions that kind of tackle that problem head on. And if you have very structured content, like here's a very concise list of different things that, can harm somebody and what to do about that, that I think is good. So, and I think Nick actually had a strong use case too with the whole legal documentation. I've read enough Baltimore City and Baltimore County code to know that stuff is so structured that the book module would actually be a very excellent solution for just being able to easily manage that.
Yeah, like you
might.
Go ahead.
So this migration from Drupal 6 to Drupal 9, it was just a natural solution because it was already using the book module, and what would we move it into? Some new structure, or do we keep what's familiar? Because they only have like 2 or 3 people that are managing this website. If we build something new, that's more training. It's less familiar, and will it work as well?
So I'm going to go down a rabbit hole here, but first I'm going to finish that last use case scenario. We keep talking about the book module, and I keep thinking of like an onboarding text, or like an HR manual, which I think somebody already managed, right? Like those seem like good use cases for that. So you're talking about this Drupal 6 to Drupal 8, 9 migration. So you were using the book. Did you actually migrate content from 6 to 8 using migration API in the book module, or was it just like manually moved over the stuff?
It was through the migrate API. That with some other content that they had, and there was some change to content types, taxonomy, things like that in transit. But the thing that stayed mostly the same was the book content. I mean, that didn't change much at all. So
overall, that was like an easy experience.
Out of all the things that we migrated, that was probably one of the easier things that we did. It's sort of like trying to migrate a menu from 6 to 9. So it kind of keeps a bit of that sort of structure for you. Again, you're using core components. And I think there's something to be said about not so much the Drupal way, but the fact that you're using a core component gains a lot of more popularity. So you're going to have a lot more documentation support for not just how to use the thing, but how to migrate it from version to version.
I will say one thing though about, because I've run migrations from Drupal 6 to Drupal 8, and it's been about 2 or 3 years, so things have improved. But I do remember when I did that, I did have to write a couple of custom plugins to get the hierarchy to move properly. The migration module API hadn't been like fully fleshed out at that point for book, and the documentation was just downright wrong in a couple of places. But again, it's because it's core, it does most things the core way. So it's a lot easier to kind of figure out what you need to do or where the gaps are. And you can find analogs elsewhere. For example, I think, if I recall, it's been a few years, but if I recall some of the hierarchy stuff that wasn't fully documented, I just looked at how the taxonomy stuff worked and was able to figure that out. I will say the one thing about book is it is one of those modules. It's not like taxonomy or node where every single site that uses Drupal uses that module. So it doesn't get as much coverage or it doesn't get looked at as much. But as Ryan pointed out, it is used by Drupal.org. It is used by a lot of these really big institutions, like, for their HR documentation or for medical text. So it is one of those modules that it's not like the color module that's getting removed from core. I don't see book module being removed from core anytime soon. So if you're using it, you can probably rely on it.
Yeah, I don't know when that book module originally came out, and I would love to kind of dive into what brought that about. I would imagine that it's a lot like other modules, again, like the forum module, things like that. It came out of a popular need, and I'm kind of curious, has that popular need changed over the course of time? I could consider almost any type of more complex website, like maybe you have an event website, and I think code of conduct and other sort of documentation could easily go in there to help organize information in a concise place, make things easier to find.
So I'm still a skeptic. And maybe that's because I haven't, like I said, I've used the book module maybe once in my entire Drupal existence. And I remember it being a little bit frustrating, but anyway, I'm just wondering, like, why not use like a system of like entity references or as we talked about, taxonomy and whatnot, to kind of like build this yourself? Like, is the book module providing like a certain permission layer and a certain organization layer that you're just not going to get, or you'd have to reproduce yourself out of Drupal core? Is that where the ease of use or the requirements come in?
Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me as considering kind of a similar sort of architecture using entity reference fields was one where you're trying to create this structure and then you're trying to depict it. We even thought about this during the migration. Like, could we do this without book? Is things like circular references or things that start to dive down a little bit. So say, for example, I have a parent and I have an entity reference that points to a child, and then we keep going down the line. What's to say that a grandchild doesn't point back to the parent? And what if I'm trying to depict that in a list of things? Does it start to create a circular reference where it's starting to go down the line and it's doing it repetitively, trying to produce that? So as long as you have safeguards that avoid that scenario, which the book module does, you can't add a child page more than once, and you can't add it to more than one book. So in that sense, it's very opinionated. Like even in the menu system, you can add an item more than once if you so wanted to. But the book module kind of pulls that back a little bit.
Yeah, but you can reference, right? So like, for example, if I had, I don't know, if I had a sub item under, parent A, and then it needed to also appear under parent D. Like, is there a way to reference from one to the other?
Aside from using a link in text, no. My understanding, my experience is add it to a place, and that's the place it lives. It doesn't give you an option to pick an alternative.
So you'd essentially add another page to that book saying like, reference this here.
Yeah. And
go ahead.
So if you think of it kind of like legal text, how you have sections, subsections, things like that, you will have subsections kind of point back to different code of law and things like that, but it won't duplicate something that exists because, well, you don't want to maintain two locations for the same information.
I desperately try not to think of legal text.
I mean, Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, I've got a really good advantage of the book module also. I mean, John, you mentioned permissions, but the administration, the creation, the hierarchy, setting of everything to do with book is all done through the content menu and the front end. Whereas as soon as you talk about taxonomy, if you want to edit a taxonomy term, you're now going to the structure menu, which is, entering the bat cave is what I call it sometimes. And, as soon as you have a certain level of technical user or non-technical user, let's say, and you say, okay, now go to that black menu up at the top. Some of them don't want to learn how to do those things. But if it's all the UI is sort of extant and available to you, the menu link to add a child page, you can set that up so you can say, whenever I hit that link, I want to create this content type. So you sort of have this like built-in UI that you can use to your advantage. And then one really cool thing, I was actually going to an old site that is like a personal wiki that I have because I had to remind myself some of the features too. There's a page you can go to. You can edit the hierarchy of the entire book, and you can have multiple books on your site, so just one book at a time. And you can edit the title of every node in the book with a single button press.
I forgot about that. That's
so
a good
that I think is the only place that I've ever seen in Drupal core where you can update multiple nodes at the same time without checking some boxes, basically.
Yeah. There's also another hidden feature there that you're talking about. Like when you're adding a page, you're adding it contextually. And of course, you can build this stuff with custom code too. But for example, if you're looking at training, many times different subsections will have the same title. Like you might have, let's just say you have a wiki that talks about all the different local development environments for Drupal. You have Lando, you have DDev, you have Doxel, et cetera, Docker console, et cetera, right? Drupal console. Each one of them might have an installation page, right? And you're going to call that installation. If you're using a normal entity reference, you have to you enter installation. You have to know which of the 15 installation pages is the one you're trying to put it under. Whereas in the book module, you just say, oh, I need to update something under installation in Lando. You click on Lando, click on installation, click add page here, and it's going to reference it automatically. So it's one of those modules that's deceptively complex and solves a problem that some people might go their entire career and not encounter it. Like if you don't work on sites that organize their data in this way, you're not going to think of the book module.
It's actually interesting because right as we're talking about this, I have a real world scenario where I may need to add like documentation to Drupal, right? And I'm like, well, being able to kind of like easily add, sub pages to certain sections, right, would be helpful. So like, yeah, like I can see a use case there. I think I'm gonna take Chad's suggestion from the top of the show and possibly play with the book module more to understand it better.
I just started thinking about when you were talking about that, John. Even they're talking about the new concept in future Drupal cores of having these sort of like starter kits. I forget what the official name for them is, but not installation profiles, but like a starting point, like a default.
Yep.
I think of Commerce Kickstart as an example of something like this, where it's like it doesn't just come with the structure. It also like adds a couple t-shirts to your store and stuff like that to sort of like get you going, but like almost like a administration section of your site, because there's the help pages. I don't know who actually visits the help pages, but some sort of like a system where there's content about your site, like what content types do we have, what taxonomies do we have, how do I like edit a layout builder page, and you could sort of customize that to the site that you're working on. That would be a great sort of like recipe to build that you could use as a starting point for a bunch of projects. And then the website documents itself, and you're not like sticking things off into a separate internal wiki site or something along those lines.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
even if it was just like, here's how you add a content, here's how you find a content type, here's how you find content, just like things that are fairly generic and constant across.
Like our use case is specific to like building out pretty complex layout builder pages. So like having that documentation in there of how you use like different components to do that would be super helpful, I think.
Announcing a new feature of the next version of the web form module. It's going to come with its own book because web form
cool,
does
really.
everything.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if that's fake news or real news, but I wouldn't be surprised.
And there are a lot of different tools. Like if we always come back to the fact that these are just solutions, and it's up to you to decide whether or not your problem matches this solution very well and whether or not it will scale, because you have to think about the longevity. How will our use cases potentially change? How will our information evolve? How will our structure grow with it? And how will this migrate to something else? How is it, portable with not just what we need structurally, but informationally? So I think it's very easy for someone to also consider other tools depending on their use case. So menus are completely adequate for what you're trying to do. Even custom block types where you're just creating structures that are necessary for your specific use case. Entity queues are another popular way of getting something into a list that's very specifically sorted. I've seen people do crazy things with taxonomy because that's just how they wanted to try to structure things. And it's not a matter of right and wrong. It's a matter of what's effective, what helps people manage these things. Another kind of user experience type of thing that I always want to bring to the forefront is your end users can have a terrible user experience if your admin user experience is terrible. So if these are tools that are very intuitive, if there's plenty of documentation, if it's easy to train, if when you use it, it's not like pulling teeth, then people are going to use it. But if you create something super custom, even if it's really complex and caters to your use case and it's beautiful from a development standpoint, if the admin user experience is terrible, well, it falls flat on its face. So
there's another benefit too of using the book module when you're doing that, because like you said, Chad, you can certainly build these experiences custom, and that's the test coverage, right? So the taxonomy module has test coverage, entity references have test coverage, the menu has test coverage, node has test coverage, but there's not test coverage for a unique combination that's essentially recreating the book module. Like do you have, unless you're writing tests yourself, which, let's be honest, a lot of people don't build out fully functional tests for their projects. If you're you might not be testing, can I create circular references adequately? You might not be testing, is the hierarchy producing the order correctly? Whereas the book module, because it's in core, has full test coverage. So that if there is a change introduced into core somewhere that breaks how that relationship works, those tests will fail and the core team will fix it before they push out whatever update they're pushing out. Whereas those changes may not take into account your custom solution. You may burn extra hours fixing that. So, even though the book module isn't something that gets a ton of attention and updates, I think that's really because it solves the problem it solves really well, and hasn't needed to be tweaked all that often. But you do get those tests, so you can be confident that the way that it works now is the way it will work in the future.
Yeah, I think that just one thing to tackle on there, because you're saying through the test coverage, it has maturity. It's existed for a long time in core. So I think if you needed support for it, or if you have a problem, you're more likely to find a solution than something custom.
Yeah.
And am I right, Chad? Like from a pure low level perspective, book stores its data in its own table.
I believe that's the case. I believe it's similar to like a menu or an entity queue or something like that. It creates its own tables for the sake of kind of saying, here are the beginnings of a book. So like a vocabulary for a taxonomy, something like that. And then here's the children, the weight of those things, and kind of the parental structure of each one of those items.
Yeah.
It's been a few years since I looked at the table, so forgive me. But
as it is part of ye olde Drupal, like the form module, like as far as I can remember, book module existed since time immemorial. Like I've been doing Drupal for 16 years, and I think it's just always been there. But it was the era before fields were in core, and I don't know that a lot of people even remember that time anymore. But so this is done in a sort of like, let's say, the way that you might do it if you were just a PHP programmer approaching a problem and not a Drupal developer approaching a problem.
And that has some performance gains too. Like if you need to index the contents of the entire book, that should be a very fast query. Versus trying to pull that from entity reference fields, I imagine that is a lot of stitched together queries.
Yeah. Yeah. Once you nest down, I mean, I remember I built I forget why I couldn't use the book module, but there was an online learning system that I used where I built a pseudo hierarchy, and once it got down to like 3 or 4 levels deep, those pages just were not performant whatsoever. But like all my clients, the clients that use it, especially for like city bylaws and stuff, those sometimes nest down 6, 8, 10 levels. I mean, because they just keep adding subsections to subsections, and they never had any performance problems whatsoever. So yeah, I remember the first time I started using book, or somebody suggested I use book, and I think that might have been the first case, was that the bylaws. I remember installing it and starting to use it and being like, why does this even exist, right? For that very reason, because it's basically menus, taxonomy, and nodes rolled into one. And I was like, why don't you just build this? And then as I started to use it, I was like, oh, it just works out of the box. It's performant, and it's really easy to add content, and I don't have to teach them anything. Like these are clients that will email me, at the time would email me every month, like, oh, how do I update this content? And I have to remind them to hit the edit tab. But for whatever reason, the book, whenever they never once asked me a question on how they had to update or edit the bylaws. So other than giving somebody new permission to be able to do it. But yeah, it's a great little module. I think it's been around as long as I can remember. But I highly recommend people give it a look if they haven't before.
So I think, was it Nick who said something about taking color module out of core? One reason why, when I saw that this subject was coming up, I was thinking, oh, are they taking book module out of core? Like, I think, is that true? Forum is moving out of core, or there's at least talk about it. But I was wondering, like, is book being sunset or like put out to the pasture? Like, it's still useful but not part of core anymore?
That's a good question. I think that'd be an even better question for the core maintainers at this point. But I think that's the area where we can all get really opinionated. And I don't know. I like kind of the two different possible directions that Drupal as a platform or as a framework, whatever label you really want to put on it, kind of takes. It could lean lightweight and just have the bare essentials to start building, kind of that toolkit, if you will. Or it could be a little bit more flexible, like I think Umami, or like you said, Commerce Kickstart, those sort of things. It's a bit more feature rich. But at what point do you say this part's core, this part's contrib?
Yeah.
And I think that's where the community opinion and the steering of things kind of deviates. And there are benefits to things to being in core. There are benefits to things being in contrib. So where does book fall?
The lack of use in my Drupal career of the book module leads me to think that contrib space would be a great place for this, because I don't need the overhead when installing Drupal. I mean, granted, it's probably not much overhead, but like one more thing on the module screen when searching through 50 modules is one too many, if you ask me.
I mean, this will probably surprise you, John, because I'm a huge fan of lean core. But like, I'm in favor of form moving out. I'm in favor of color moving out.
Don't do it, Nick. Don't do
the
it.
book module belongs in core.
Get out of here.
I really do, because
Get out of here. How many, like over the last 3 years, how many times have you used the book module?
I mean, I have 3 or 4 clients using it right now, but I think more importantly, I also think it's one of those ones that, like Ryan said, Drupal.org uses it extensively. And I think that's a good,
That's
I think
fine.
on some level, that's a good enough reason.
I'm not
keep it in
saying
core.
that they
You'll
can't install it via Contrib and use it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just solves. I think it's one of those modules that's bedrock to a lot of people, but if it wasn't in core, it wouldn't get the attention that it needs.
I mean, I don't know. I just don't think it. I don't think it suits a use case for a large number of sites, right? When I pull Drupal off the shelf, like most of the time, I'm not looking to use the book module. I think one thing Ryan did say that is interesting, right, is a starter kit built around book, where you could say like, hey, you need a documentation service, or you need a documentation library, wiki, or something like that. Okay, well, book's going to be in there because, hey, it's really good at that. But yeah, I mean, we could debate this for the next hour and a half to 2 hours if we wanted to, and it would still be in core when we wake up tomorrow morning. So one thing I don't know that we've covered, or if we have, I don't think it's been clear to me, is Chad, where do you think the book module kind of falls flat or doesn't make sense in a use case, right? Like if I'm like building something and I'm seriously considering book, like what are some pitfalls I may find, or an area where I might have to say, oh, nope, don't want to use that because of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, it's the I grab the hammer and I look for nails problem, even though I just found a screw and now I'm using a hammer for a screwdriver, the little claw part. I think the book module is going to be one of those things that falls very flat as soon as you have the entire content of your website mutating, growing, changing over the course of time, and the book module isn't necessarily capable of keeping up with either the structural needs or the navigation needs. That's when it really is just the menu system, or just a collection of a little bit more clever things that you need to portray on individual pages versus this repetitive sort of use case. And you can start grabbing at a lot of these different ideas that it's not about the problem that you have today. It's about the foresight of the problems that you may have in the future as well. It's a bit of both. So if you don't have a use case right now for a book module, just leave it on the shelf. Like any other tool, just leave it on the shelf. Know what it's good at, know what it's not good at. But there are a couple of things that it doesn't do. So a node can't exist in 2 books. So if you have that use case, book module is going to frustrate you. The first book page is the beginning of the book. So you can't, if you haven't published that page yet, you can't add children to that book. It's just something that happens with the book module. Like, so if it's, you started a new book and you want to start it, but you don't want it to be published until you have a few pages, well, you can't do that. You have to publish that first page. And the last one is that at least I was able to glean is reordering the book. If you move some stuff around, you're going to have to clear the cache for that to be reflected to end users, which isn't, in my opinion, that big of a deal. But you need to be aware of that if you have a really complex caching setup, which some Drupal sites are like house of cards when it comes to caching.
Yeah, I think there's kind of 2 other cases too that you have to keep in mind. One is similar to a page can exist in more than one book. You can't have those circular references. So sometimes you have a page that does need to show up in 2 different locations. You just can't do that with book, which is kind of a corollary of it can't be in 2 books. But you also can't do it in a single book easily. The second thing, and this isn't something I personally experienced, but I do remember, it's one of those things that I kind of stored in the back of my mind, and maybe it's not true anymore, but I do remember hearing about performance issues if you have a lot of little books or just a lot of books. So for example, if you have 200 books on your site and you try to have a view that shows the list of books, I think it builds the hierarchy behind the scenes. And so if you visit that view, you're gonna bog down your site. You'll run into trouble. Like I said, that's one of those facts that kind of vague memories of running into that issue when I was testing some stuff. So
like a book with 200,000 pages or something.
Or vice versa. Yeah, if you have, I think that's probably less of a problem. I think it's a going wide problem rather than going.
Isn't that true of any site? Like if it has 200,000 pages, like you may have a problem when you try to get a query of all of them.
Yeah. Or if you try assigning books as pages of other books, which you can do, I think, if you break some rules, I think that also runs into problems.
Break some rules. Oh dear. So it sounds to me like you have to have pretty well organized data structure in order to use book effectively, right? So like the book part of the site has to be like maybe like documentation or a wiki or something very specific, and then like you could have other pieces of that site, like other content types for pages and things that are more like outside of the like kind of structure of that. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. It does work with any content type though. So you're not relegated to just the book content type. You can start with that and you can kind of mix and match what can be used by the book module.
Right. So I guess I was more talking about like overall site structure.
Yeah. And I think that when it comes to some of the challenges that you might face with performance, like I could see using like a Solar Index or something like that for the collection of books to kind of like overcome that huge list. Again, you need to re-index and deal with caching and whatnot. Yeah. But I think, we have strong use cases for book where it obviously makes sense, and then you just deal with the challenges. Sometimes that might include installing some custom modules like or contrib modules like the layout builder kit is one. So if you use layout builder extensively, you want to be able to place those pieces within your layout. Or the custom book block was another module that I came across that was really popular to kind of extend on those use cases. But then you might also have a really poor use case for book. So I don't think that you need to necessarily chase it. If it's a good fit, it's a good fit for a lot of the reasons that we've identified. If not, then.
Yeah, I will say it's one of those things that if I have a website that had a use case for book and the book module did not exist, it would be one of those things that would be deceptively difficult to build custom. It's just one of those things that you think about it like, oh, it's just a content hierarchy. That's easy. I can build a view for it. And there's just so many little edge cases that the book module has solved and solved really well that it's just a deceptively, I think it's one of those things where it solves the problem so well that people think it isn't a difficult problem. And that type of hierarchy, that type of relational data or relationships is difficult. It takes on a heavy load. So as we get towards the end of the show, I think we're getting to another prediction. What do you guys think the future of the book module looks like?
I think that if you look at how old it is, because of its age, it comes saddled with a lot of expectations from the community as to how it will continue to exist. And it's really hard to change that sort of precedent when you have such a large community backing Drupal. However, if something like the forum module is coming out and going to contrib, I could still see a bit of an argument to doing that. The hesitation that I have there is forum doesn't need nurturing. It has enough usage and popularity that I think as contrib it would thrive and be fine, and the contrib community would be a-okay with it. When you have modules like book, I don't know if it would necessarily thrive. I think it would need to be nurtured to maintain a level of health in later versions of Drupal. So that's kind of where I land a little bit with where it might go.
I think it like that kind of begs the question for me, right? Of like, if it moves to contrib and like nobody nurtures it, right? Is that okay? Like, is it something where like, and this is kind of what this whole show has been about. Is there a better solution to book? Like, it has a very specific set of use cases and tools. I just wonder if that's like the next evolution of it, right? Is like, hey, it's been kind of dragged along with, Drupal 6, Drupal 7, Drupal 8, Drupal 9, right? Like if we put it out into contrib and it does flourish and we see, hey, there are like 600, 1,000, 10,000 sites using this thing. Like, okay, there's a space, like there's a place for it. Let's like, keep it going. Or the reverse happens, right? Like we see like, hey, there are two sites using it. Nick's and Chad's site are both using it. That's great. Like maybe there isn't that much of a use case. So I think that's a natural evolution. And, I think as somebody who again has not used it very widely, I think, I after the show, I see a use case for it. But I think I'd like to see it in contrib as opposed to in Drupal core.
Yeah. One thing I think about, in my job when I'm doing solutioning is like, we always have to ask this question. Do we build it with Drupal? Do we build it with some other tool? Or do we take an off-the-shelf product? And there are a lot of off-the-shelf projects that do have this use case, but they also tend to be integrated into a larger whole, right? So like, Microsoft has their SharePoint thing. Yep. There's Confluence that, I use on an everyday basis. I'm sure if you go to any major supplier of business software, maybe, Google Drive is really one of the weird exceptions where it's like you manage it like a file. You're not managing it like a wiki. But, and there's Wikipedia, but how many real like robust installations of Wikipedia are there in the world? It's a small number, but the ones that do use it are gigantic, right? And that use it very well. And the ones that don't use it very well probably shouldn't have been on Wikipedia. They probably could have gone to something where they're like Octopress, like generating a static site out of markdown files. So, does it make sense for it to be in Drupal? It's a really good question. Like, I don't know that I have the answer right now. One thing I remember I've used it for in the past, we were talking about like intranet sites, was actually there was an intranet site I worked on, and it also had organic groups. So it was like organic groups would make a book for each group. And I think maybe that's also how groups.drupal.org maybe has a functionality kind of like that as well, where you can sort of like have documentation related to each group. It's like if you have a really specific case like that, and you need to do it for I know, for example, like let's say NVIDIA is a giant developer website, and they have thousands and thousands of people that have to go and use the NVIDIA documentation to figure out like, how do I make a graphics card dance? And how do I make it like calculate, 10 billion calculations in a minute or whatever the thing they need to do? You're going to need a really robust documentation, but you don't want to know about any of the other documentation that's related to something else, because I'm just looking for this one thing right now. Like,
or another driver version.
Yeah, like I don't know in this particular case. Yeah, that's a really good, right? Versioning of things. I just want to look inside this hierarchy. So there might be some really, really good use cases for it. Does it belong in core? That I think it's maybe at this point an existential question we can't answer on this podcast. But it's a really good question. One of the other things I think about too is like interactivity. One reason why would we want to pull forum out into contrib is because the other solutions for forum cost money, right? And one of the huge advantages of something like Drupal is if I have the time to manage it, I can. So if I want to manage my own forum and write my own forum software and hack Drupal core, there's an open source way to do that. If I want to have a monolithic site that has all my documentation in it, Book is a really good solution for that. Yeah. So I think it should exist. Should it exist in core? I don't know.
I'll be the lone champion for Book. Staying in core. this episode, which is a departure, because I think form shouldn't be in core. I think that's a good move. I think it's and I think one of the reasons is that there are better other open source, like there are some paid projects, but there's better open source systems for managing a form that you can integrate with Drupal. And form just doesn't get, maybe if there was a team that developed form and added features and maintained it, like maybe it would do better in the Drupal world. But as it stands, I think form is another one of those projects that's really complex, very difficult to solve. Spam is a major issue when you're managing that through Drupal, and it just doesn't get the time and attention that it needs to flourish in the Drupal ecosystem. But yeah, I mean, the most spam I've ever seen on a site is one of the only sites I ever used the form module on, and advanced form. And I remember that battle was lost before it began. But yeah, I mean, the book module, if it's not something that you've used, if you're looking at documentation for a site or some sort of article content, then definitely explore the book module, whether it stays in core or moves to contrib. The problem that it solves really well. So make sure that you keep in mind that it's a tool in your tool belt. Chad, I would like to thank you for joining us again from your new location and sharing what you know about the book module. It's been a pleasure having you back.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you very much for having me. I don't think that my wife and I would have been able to as easily move out to Canada. I think we were really ripe for change from Baltimore. ImageX has been a fantastic company to work with. Worked with a lot of Ukrainians. So if anybody's interested, there's a donation link as well to help the Ukrainian ImageX team, support them through what's going on over there. But it's always fantastic to talk to you guys. I really love just ideating a little bit about how we can make Drupal better as a community and how we can learn and teach other people.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad, yes, this Chad's book corner, sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. You can learn more about this at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support's greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button in the sidebar.
Chad, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what would be the best way?
Yeah, so a couple different easy places. I'm on Drupal.org, Chad Hester, simple enough. I'm on Twitter, Chad K. Hester, and I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there and let me know what you want to chat about.
And Ryan, how about you?
Yeah, I go by Liberator with the Web 2.0 spelling, so you have to take the last vowel out. That definitely was a time and place for trying to get reserved keywords. So usually I'm that, Drupal.org, Twitter, Instagram. I do exist on LinkedIn. Also, small plug, the funding module, something that I've been working on as a community project to try and get the button to make donations to a project on Drupal.org. We're kind of waiting for Drupal.org to upgrade off of Drupal 7, but hopefully that will be coming soon.
Very cool. And John, how about you?
Awesome. I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, as well as Drupal.org. And you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
You can find me online pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.
Next week.